Yonah Jeremy Bob is the Jerusalem Post senior military correspondent and intelligence analyst. And he, along with Alon Ivatur, is the author of Target Tehran, How Mossad is Using Sabotage, Cyberwarfare, Assassination, and Secret Diplomacy to Realign the Middle East. Yonah Bob, welcome to The Gist.
Glad to be here.
So what a book is using, has used. Let's just start with Ehud Barak's warning that Fordow could represent what he called, I think, a zone of immunity. Of course, I'm talking about the Fordow reactor because of the recent, or the Fordow operation, because of the recent U.S. strikes. But what was the concern, and do the bombs recently allay that concern?
Yeah, so we're talking about the 2010 period, and this is before the United States has developed, to the extent it has today, the mother of all bombs, and then the even more advanced mother of all bombs, the MOP, that penetrates 30,000-pound bomb going deep under a mountain. And so the idea was that they didn't want Iran to be operating Fordow, again, like this key nuclear facility that Iran has that's under a mountain. They didn't want it to be operational. They didn't want them to be able to move centrifuges there. They wanted to attack the Iranian nuclear program before it could be moved, before those pieces could be moved under the mountain, basically. And so you could say, luckily, or if you read our book, Target Tehran, you'll see, because the Mossad stopped them over and over again for the last 15 years, until a point where the United States had a bomb that was able to still destroy Fordow and all of that machinery, nuclear machinery underneath the mountain. But in 2010, they didn't have that weaponry. So if you go back in time, that's what Ehud Barak was worried about, was them breaking out to a nuclear weapon in a time period when there was no weaponry, which could necessarily destroy Fordow.
Right. So just to contextualize everything, 10, 12 years ago, the idea was, oh no, they're going to be able to pursue their nuclear ambitions, which were documented, though maybe much of the world and international agencies didn't believe the documentation or rebutted it. And then Mossad, through daring raids, which you chronicle, made it incontrovertible that this was going on. But the concern was they're going to be able to have an operation that there is no way to stop. And this was seen as maybe through what the Mossad, what Shin Bet, what intelligence in Israel said was maybe we could do whatever we can through guile, through our methods to try to stop this. But it does represent a giant problem in that our main adversary, or one of our main adversaries who vows to kill us, seems to be, unless something massive happens, seems to be on a glide path to achieving the means to destroy us. And I just want to point out that everything has changed, and many in the West seem to take it for granted or see it more as a negative, that this horrible inevitability has actually been unplugged and destroyed.
Yeah, look, Israeli military intelligence said in the late 1990s that if nobody intervened, Iran would have a nuclear weapon within 2.5 years. The only reason that up until now, Iran did not get a nuclear weapon, the 2015 nuclear deal did delay things to some extent. But the main reason, certainly until 2015 and even after the 2015 deal started to fall apart, was the Mossad over and over again, whether it's blowing up a nuclear facility, whether it's taking out a nuclear scientist, just making it impossible for Iran to get across the line, to get to that point, slowing them down, making them have to rebuild instead of, progressing. And so what's happened in the last 12 days is Israel did, I would say, maybe 80% of the work in terms of wiping out the key components of the nuclear program. You take the Natanz nuclear facility, the largest one. You take the Isfahan nuclear facility. If you want, I can talk in more detail why that one is also very specifically important. And then dozens of smaller ones. And then the United States came in and took out Fordow, which was at least, 20% of Iran's nuclear program. They had advanced centrifuges there. They had 60% enriched uranium there. Those were things that needed to go. If the United States hadn't taken that out, we write in Target Tehran that Israel could have damaged it, but it could not have, as Trump, like say, obliterated it. And, so there would have still...
But that's probably inaccurate. Sorry to interrupt. Obliterate is probably inaccurate, right?
Yes, you're right. They probably didn't obliterate everything, but blow it up a lot more, damage it a lot more. 30,000-pound bomb is a lot more than 5,000 and 2,000-pound bombs, which is what Israel has. So
Yes.
that has sort of taken the Iranian nuclear threat off the table for now. I would say it's probably pushed it off at least 2 years. And that's in a situation where probably Iran was only several months away from a nuclear weapon if it made the decision. So that's a big improvement. And it may be a lot more than 2 years because Iran now may sign a better deal. And if it doesn't, and if it tries to break out again, Israel has now proven that it can take out pretty much anything that Iran puts out there.
If the United States does this again.
So you're talking about if the United States, you mean if Iran built another facility
I was
under
reacting
a
to the very last phrase where you said Israel's proved it could do this, but that's depending on something like the United States involvement and gigantic mop bombs.
Right. So the interesting question is there's one new facility under Natanz. There's a lot of different facilities. So there's one new facility that Iran is building under a mountain near Natanz. It's not operational yet. And so if Iran started to move operations into there, yeah, that would be another situation where the United States would be needed to come in or would be more reliable to be able to destroy it again, if that's something Iran tries to do.
Yeah. So I want to kind of take this piece by piece. An American might be hearing this and saying, well, why couldn't we just rely on Israel, which maybe this American will see an Iranian bomb is just an Israeli problem, certainly much more of an Israeli problem than an American problem. Why couldn't Israel just do what it's doing through its guile, cunning, and funding from the United States and keep setting back the Iranian nuclear program 6 months, 10 months, a year at a time as they had been? Why wasn't that? Why'd you need the United States? I understand the big bomb pushes it back 2 years, but voicing the concerns of this American seems manageable without us.
Okay, so I think the first question is, does the United States need to worry about a nuclear threat? And I would say that the North Korea example shows that it does. Right? I mean, look, you could say the United States has had a nuclear threat from the Soviet Union, Russia for a very long time, but it still seems like as crazy as Vladimir Putin is, he actually isn't. He threatened 1 million times to use nuclear weapons during this fight with Ukraine. He hasn't done it. He's probably not that crazy. The North Koreans are a much smaller rogue country, and we don't know what they'd be willing to do. And the Iranians are a rogue religious fundamentalist country, and we don't know what they would be willing to do. So if they could, for years, people said, well, they could enrich to 5% uranium, but they'll never get to 20%. They get to 20%, they'll never get to 60%. They're pretty smart, the Iranians. And so they could probably also figure out how to do what's called an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, which could reach the United States. And so basically, the United States wants Israel to get rid of as much of this problem as possible. But I think what was huge, and I can't emphasize it enough, but the United States stepping in with the mega bunker buster it's a statement to Iran. We will not let you get a nuclear weapon. Neither Israel nor we. It's something that every president has said, and most Iranians have sort of laughed. Ha ha ha. We know that actually you're not serious about that. If we really went for it, you would be afraid to stop us. And this is a clear action, not words, clear action saying, Iran, you are not going to get a nuclear weapon. So I think if they don't go for a nuclear weapon in the future, one of the reasons will be that they didn't just get bombed by Israel, they also got bombed by this 30,000-pound mother of all bombs by the United States.
Yeah, I'll also add to that the conceptia of deterrence with Hamas was, oh, why not do it? It seems maintainable. We'll mow the lawn. And then suddenly it wasn't. And certainly the Israelis, such as yourself, changed their attitude towards what do we do with maybe not imminent threats, but looming threats. And they changed their attitude, which was we have to attack them head on. So I would say that certainly factors into it, right?
Yeah, look, Israel was allowing looming threats as long as they didn't actually come. So it allowed Hezbollah to go from 10,000 rockets after the 2006 Second Lebanon War, after Israel, sort of beat Hezbollah, they let them go from 10,000 rockets to 150,000 rockets. And they let, Iranian militias build up in Syria. And Israel allowed the Houthis to build up threats in Yemen. Nobody in Israel dreamed that the Houthis in Yemen would shoot at Israel. And they let Hamas build up a huge rocket arsenal, much more qualitatively superior to what Hamas had, let's say the last major round between Israel and Hamas in 2014, and certainly before that. So Israel allowed all of these looming threats to happen based on the idea that all of these entities, terrorist organizations, some of them countries knew that if they really messed with Israel, there would be, major punishment, and that would deter them from doing it. And that is not the mentality now. The mentality now is you start to build a looming threat, we will bomb you. We're not going to wait to see whether you come in. Israel saw on October 7th that people in the Middle East are not always rational actors. They're willing to kill 1,200 people, mostly civilians, and rape and torture and all kinds of things. And so Israel is going to have a forward posture on all of the different fronts to make sure that a looming threat can't one day just jump in and surprise.
But Israel had many strategic and military successes against Iran and its proxies. And it had, as we've seen, established air dominance over Iran, which a few years ago, because of a lot of factors, would seem inconceivable. But from your reporting, instincts, everything else, did Netanyahu just hope that he'd get to that point and then be able to convince the U.S. president, who was Donald Trump? Or was there something more than we're just going to present to him the argument that it should be done now, and we think that our argument will win out?
So I wrote an exclusive in the last couple days in the Jerusalem Post about the evolution of Netanyahu himself. That everybody has sort of always thought that Netanyahu was this big, tough guy who loves military force. You take a look at 2012, 2014, 2021. Those are the sort of big conflicts Netanyahu was involved in. He was terrified of using force. They barely touched Gaza. All right, they shot from the air. They barely invaded anything. Even after October 7th, I'm told by basically every source on the security establishment, Netanyahu was terrified of going into Gaza. And something changed when Netanyahu saw that the IDF was tearing Hamas's military apparatus apart. The political apparatus is still there, but the military apparatus apart. By summer 2024, all of the 24 Hamas battalions are taken apart. He gains new level of confidence. And that takes us to the Hezbollah Beepers operation, which was a major gamble, all right? All Israeli defense officials had said that if Israel went into a big war with Hezbollah, Hezbollah could kill thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Israelis, and Israel has a lopsided major victory over Hezbollah with almost no losses on the Israeli side. From that, Netanyahu says, okay, maybe I can do this with Iran also. And what he did have going for him is already in October 2024, which was a second back and forth round, sort of a prelude between Israel and Iran. Iran fired 200 ballistic missiles on Israel. Israel took out all of Iran's best anti-aircraft defense systems called the S-300. So then Netanyahu did know that sort of the skies would be easier, clearer for Israel to attack. But he also thought that Trump was going to be in favor of it from the beginning. Candidate Trump said in October 2024, Israel, go ahead, take out the nuclear program. President Trump suddenly started saying, I'm the peacemaker. I don't want Israel to attack. I want to negotiate a big deal. And so actually Israel was really disappointed. Don't believe this narrative that they were all on the same page all along. They were not on the same page. And there was a point where Netanyahu thought maybe they wouldn't be able to attack at all. And finally, when the negotiations between Iran and Trump hit a wall in early June, that's when they said, okay, we can take advantage of this situation, roll the dice. They did not know whether Trump would come in. They absolutely did not know. It was a roll of the dice. And they were ready, if they had to attack Fordow, as we describe in Target Tehran. But they hoped that if they were successful enough that Trump wouldn't be able to resist getting a piece of that success. It turned out the gamble worked, but it was a gamble.
Yeah. And that brings me to my next question. And I have to admit the last one was a leading question, so is this. Because I knew that you wrote that piece. I should note that the idea of Netanyahu as a warmonger, but then actually being seen, especially by many in the Obama administration, one key official was quoted as calling him chicken shit, then forms my next question, which is that recently on a Pod Save the World podcast, Ben Rhodes, who was behind a lot of the negotiation between and selling the JCPOA, a former Obama foreign relations official and communications official, noted that, and he was critical of Trump's decision to bomb Fordow. He said, there was no imminent threat from the Iranian nuclear program. Nothing had changed materially from a few weeks ago other than Israel disrupting Trump's own diplomacy and beginning to bomb Iran and demanding that Trump came in. What would you say to that critique?
So if we're defining imminent threat as was Iran about to develop a nuclear weapon that week or that month, then he's right. But Iran is a country of 90 million people. They had dozens of nuclear sites. They're a country that's multiple times the size of France. And the fact is that they were advanced enough in their nuclear program that they no longer needed large facilities all the time where you would be able to easily follow what they were doing with the uranium and how they were advancing. They were already at a point where, according to the IAEA itself, they could, within weeks, maybe even days, enrich and weaponize enough uranium for 10 to 15 nuclear weapons. That doesn't mean fire them. Fire them would be a few more months, maybe several months. But basically, they were really close, and a lot of the other things that we need to do to fire them, playing with neutrons and shockwave generators, you could do in smaller facilities. It would be hard to follow. It is possible. People, would talk about, could Iran break out to a nuclear weapon? The fear was Iran would sneak out to a nuclear weapon. They could do it in a facility that no one was watching, that was not high profile. And so you put that together with, again, I mentioned Israel took out Iran's best anti-aircraft defenses in October 2024. That was something that wasn't going to last. Iran was going to repair them. So I think when you put all of those elements together, and then the last key element is October 2025, right? That's the end of some of the key limits of the Iran nuclear deal. That's the end of the ability to snap back all of the global sanctions on Iran from the 2015 nuclear deal. Put all of those elements together. Basically, Israel did believe that it had a period of months. June, July, August, I don't know if that mattered. But Israel did believe that there was a window of a period of months, that if it missed that period, the situation could be dire. The situation could at the very least be much more difficult.
Yeah. And in a nutshell, the driving factor wasn't the imminence of the nuclear acquisition. It was the conditions of allowing such a strike to happen with, as we saw, no casualties, maximum safety for whoever was conducting the strike. And the second part of that is, well, what's the good amount of time for Iran to be close to a nuclear program? Do we all decide it's 2 weeks and be sure that our intelligence is right about that? Do we decide it's 6 months and say, well, that's certainly enough, and also be sure our intelligence is perfect there? I mean, there are no great choices or clear choices here, but as I understand it, that is what was in the consideration of both the Iranian and the the American and the Israeli officials. Is that right?
Yeah, the amount of time was too small, and the ability of Iran to hide what they were doing was elevated. And as you said, Israel had a easier ability to act. You put all of those things together. This was a unique period of time, which is really felt, not just Netanyahu, Israeli defense officials felt they couldn't let pass, and that after X number of months, the window would close. And by the way, you brought up at the very beginning of our conversation, Ehud Barak. In 2010, the entire Israeli defense establishment was against Netanyahu hitting the nuclear facilities because they thought it was too hard, because they didn't think Iran was that close. That was not the case this time. The entire Israeli defense establishment wanted to take the shot, believed that it could, and believed that Iran was too close.
Yeah. So another critique, and this is from the same podcast, though it might have been voiced by Rose's co-host Tommy Vitor, before Trump took this strike, the idea was that actually maybe they'd only be able to set the nuclear program back about 6 months because they couldn't get it Fordow, because they couldn't destroy these deep underground sites. But then the Israeli foreign minister was out there saying before Trump took this strike that they'd set it back 2 years. And he also noted that now after the strike, they're also saying 2 years. Therefore, we can't really trust anything that's being said. How much did we really set the Iranians back? It seems to either be 6 months or 2 years, just based on whatever narrative wants to be grasped for. What's your thoughts on that?
So look, let's forget about the numbers for a second and talk about the capabilities. The key elements here are the advanced centrifuges, all right? Until a few years ago, Iran had, we'll call them slow centrifuges. They're called the IR-1s. And then if you just go up in numbers, they got up to IR-4s and IR-6s. Those are able to enrich uranium much faster and to much higher quality. All of that means get a nuclear weapon much faster with less machinery, okay? So those things had to be destroyed, all right? And then you have the 60% enriched uranium, all right? That's the material that already is almost ready to be a nuclear weapon. That material needs to be destroyed. And then there's the finishing pieces. I mentioned Isfahan. Isfahan is sort of what takes some of the uranium and makes it together into metal that can be put on a warhead, and the hemispheres that you put on a warhead, all of these sort of final touches in order to actually be able to make it into a nuclear weapon. So you need to blow all of those things up. And as long as Fordow wasn't blown up, they had advanced centrifuges, they had 60% enriched uranium. So whether you had pushed them back, 6 months or 8 months or a year by blowing up Natanz and Isfahan and the other places, they still had a serious threat because they had most of the key elements were at Fordow in smaller amounts than at Natanz. Natanz had the most. So why are people so excited about Natanz? Because it had the most centrifuges, the most uranium. And so that's, when the foreign minister, Gideon Nassar, is making a big deal about it, I think that's what he's referring to. And if you talk about the IAEA, when they were saying Iran had enough uranium for 10 to 15 nuclear weapons, so probably most of those are gone after Natanz, but if you still have enough for 3 or 4 nuclear weapons at Fordow, and the centrifuges, advanced ones, to enrich fast, to weaponize them, that was a big problem. Once you take out Fordow, then you can talk about 2 years, because they're missing all of those pieces. They can't redo one piece and hook it up to another piece. They have to redo all those pieces at the same time, and that's difficult.
There's been some reliable reporting that indicates that the material, the 60% enriched uranium, might well have been spirited out of Fordow in advance of the strike. There were many trucks pictured there at the facility. We're only talking about 400 kilograms, 880 pounds of material. So the two-part question is it likely in your reporting that that's happened? And even if it has, what does it mean?
I think the whole question about the trucks, look, it's very exciting for, us in the media, and it's sort of like a snapshot, and it's easy to explain to the public. But the trucks, I don't think, are the point. The point is, has Iran succeeded in hiding some of its uranium from Israel and the United States? I'm sure it has. But
so it still has some of the 60%
I'm sure
uranium.
It has
we don't know how
some 60% uranium,
yes.
But I think it's very little. When people are talking about, look, they might have moved all of it out, I think that's nonsense. All right, take a look at what Israel did in penetrating this country. They killed, in the first day, 9 out of 13 military chiefs. They didn't have 1 or 2 agents there on the first day. They had hundreds of agents, all right? They blew up, hundreds of different targets all in one day. That means unbelievable penetration in every single part of Iran. So if they're moving uranium from point A to point B, Israel's following that. If you go back to my book, Target Tehran, the Iranians moved their nuclear secrets from a whole bunch of different sites to a really good hiding place, this abandoned warehouse in Tehran with no footprint, basically no guards, no satellites are looking at it. And it was a great plan, except the Mossad knew the old sites and followed them to the new sites. So I don't accept this idea that, yes, the Mossad is able to take out all of these hundreds of targets penetrate Iran with hundreds of agents, and somehow they're going to completely miss the movement in the uranium. That seems to be, to me, nonsense. I also am sure the Iranians could get some amount of something past, intelligence, and they need to keep an eye on that. But the idea that all of the uranium has been moved and Israel didn't hit any of it, if you look at what Israel was able to do, it just makes no sense.
Okay, so you're saying it's nonsense because it's logical that the capabilities that Israel showed in that attack are such that they just wouldn't have let these trucks go by. Trucks that we know about because I guess commercial satellite imaging showed that. And so therefore, if some commercial satellite imaging that is shared with the world's media showed that, we're sure that Israel also had that intelligence.
Correct. And that Israel has hit, I think, something like 30 nuclear sites. Again, in the media, we only know how to focus on like 2 or 3 things. So we talk about Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. But Israel's hit like 30 nuclear sites. So my understanding from sources is some of the uranium might have been moved and been hit at some of these smaller sites.
Okay, so some of the headlines are fears over Iran's missing 400 kilograms of uranium. That was in the Times of London. It's not the most tawdry headline. That's from something called Times Now. I don't know what this is, but the 400 kilograms of missing uranium from Fordow, that's haunting Washington and Tel Aviv. And I only raise that to say, is it haunting Tel Aviv, do you think?
I don't think it's haunting Tel Aviv. Again, I think that there are a lot of people in a lot of countries that were against this operation, and they want to present this operation as a failure or as something that shouldn't have happened. And one of the ways you can do that is say, they blew up the buildings, but they didn't get the uranium. And so that's like this great narrative. Look, nothing was accomplished. Again, forget about the politics, because I think there are, ways that you could say, this could have been resolved differently. And you could say that this operation wasn't necessary, and you could make those arguments. But to say that Israel just missed the most important piece of all of this when they got dozens of nuclear scientists, dozens of nuclear sites, almost all the top Iranian officials, it doesn't make sense to me. It's not the feel that I'm getting from Israeli officials. And I have had times where Israeli officials expressed to me we're worried that we missed something. This isn't one of them.
When Operation Spiderweb was executed by the Ukrainians, did it make the Israelis nervous that it would blow their upcoming operation in Iran?
That is a great question. I haven't asked them that. I'm going to write that down to ask them that in the future. I'll project that the answer is yes. I just said a second ago that Israelis do worry, and Israelis...
Yeah, they're known for that.
Yeah. Israelis...
for a couple reasons.
Super worry about informational security. We have an Israeli censor here that sometimes will let me and others publish something 2 or 3 times, and then they'll decide that the 4th time, because something is going on in the news that they think the bad guys are going to pay more attention to, that suddenly we can't publish it, even though we've already published it 3 times before. So I think Israelis are super worried about operational security. I would guess that probably did get them concerned.
Yeah. That's interesting, by the way. You probably argue, but it's already out there. It was out there last week, and they say, yeah, we don't want to emphasize that now to remind anyone. Is your relationship with the censor, how contentious is it?
I believe that every journalist in Israel has a contentious relationship with the censor. I will say that I have worked with them long enough, and it helps actually to have done books with them, because when you do books, you get to speak to higher up managers. And so then if you have a problem with a particular article that you're dealing with, Joe Schmo, who's 20 years old, you can call the manager and say, can you help me out with this guy? They don't know what they're doing. And the higher up managers have, more leeway and sort of a more nuanced understanding of the issues. So I would say that it's always contentious. It's not specific to me. It's all of us, all journalists would prefer that there was no Israeli censor, and that the way it worked would be honor system. Don't mess over national security of your country. If you mess over the national security of your country, you can get in trouble, which is true in the United States also. Right. That's how we would all prefer it. By and large, I've gotten a lot of things through. I mean, if you read the book, the number of things I was able to get through that aren't, 25-year-old, 50-year-old operations, things that happened just in the last 2 or 3 years
Oh, yeah.
was incredible.
The next question is not to ask you to consider the unintended consequences of the next action I'm going to talk about or the legal entanglements internationally, but it's this. Is an alive Ayatollah Khamenei more useful or less useful to Israeli strategic interests?
So I personally have not been in favor of taking out Khamenei. I think if you look at the history of sort of over forcing regime change from a foreign entity, that it doesn't work. It didn't work in Afghanistan, it didn't work in Iraq, it didn't work for Israel and Lebanon. You can help a local population do their own revolution. That's worked in a bunch of places, but they have to want it, they have to fight for it. And so I don't know that what Israel did in this operation was enough, but I thought it was interesting the last couple of days when they started to bomb the IRGC internal security units, the Basij militia units, right? The Basij, that's the militia that it was created specifically to beat up Iranians when the regime was afraid that the army wouldn't want to do that. And so, to bomb those units so that there would be less oppression, less forces to oppress Iranians if a protest movement breaks out again, as so many have before. So that, I think, was an interesting strategy. Specifically taking out Khamenei, I think there's a lot of other Khameneis out there. They have a lot of radical clerics, a lot of nasty IRGC people. I think they could replace him pretty fast. I think you need a local movement getting some outside help. And I think you need an Iranian general. You need an Iranian general who's willing to take the side of the people against the clerics. That's my formula for if you want regime change to actually happen.
And what's the debate like in Israeli intelligence circles?
I think there's a big disagreement about it. I think there are people who say Khamenei is a radical himself. He's a fanatic. He's so anti-Israel. He's so, mistrusting that nobody who would replace him would be as bad or certainly wouldn't be worse. And so some say, it would have been worth it to take him out. I don't believe it ever became such a practical issue because Trump was saying very clearly, don't take him out. Mm-hmm. And as we saw today, Israel was sending aircraft to bomb, I believe, probably dozens of targets in Iran. And Trump sent out a tweet after he spoke with Netanyahu on the phone that said, send the aircraft back. And they ended up bombing one unmanned radar station to just sort of like send a message to Iran. If Iran shot 2 ballistic missiles at Israel, breaking the ceasefire, this was Israel, a symbolic coming back. So I don't think the Khamenei issue ever rose to the point of like, should we really do it or not? Because Trump was blocking it.
Was there any part of the debate that argued, he's quite the opposite of a tactical genius. Maybe it benefits us from him being in place?
I don't think anybody thought that it benefits to have him in place. I think there were people that said, good to take him out. There were people that said not good to take him out because it could rally the Iranian public around the regime. And it could also open, not that there aren't foreign entities that have been interested in killing Israeli prime ministers, but it would sort of give them like a very clear basis to do it if you take out somebody else's head of state. Anyway, there are all kinds of concerns by the people who didn't want to take out Khamenei. I did not hear anybody saying the guy's a moron, leave him in charge.
Yeah. And now I'm going to make just a domestic U.S. politics aside that you don't have to comment on. I just find it interesting that the United States president can tweet or truth a sentence, and this will call back planes in Israel, but he can't call back planes in America when they've left to deposit prisoners in foreign prisons. That's it. You don't have to comment. Do you think, obviously, you always have to be vigilant, but what are the capacities of Iranian sleeper cells, assailants? And I bring this up because here where I'm sitting in Brooklyn, there was a supposed attempted assassination at a very soft target, a journalist who was a critic of the regime, and they put a lot of pressure on her family in the regime. But these assassins, who were supposedly also Trump assassins, were bumbling and didn't strike terror. I mean, I wasn't the target, but didn't inspire terror. But that is my question. What is their capacity that we know of?
There's a wide variety. There was an operation by Iran and the IRGC to kill Israelis in Turkey a couple of years ago. And it was such a bumbling operation, and they were outed so easily and all arrested so easily in cooperation between the Mossad and Turkey at the time, that the IRGC intelligence chief was fired like the same day. Like they didn't even, give him a chance, to sort of have a hearing the week later. He was fired the same day. So,
by the way, did that ultimately spare his life?
You know what? I stopped following him after he was fired. I should look into that. That's a good question.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe he's better off. I did not think about that angle. Get fired 2 years earlier. Yeah.
Right. Or like the guy, you're not a good enough physicist. We're busting you down to computer programming. Saved his life.
Saved his life. Good point. But all of that said, there have been a number of successful Iranian terror operations all over Europe, in South America, in Israel, in the United States. They are, what I would say the difference between them and the Mossad is probably, the spectrum that I would say they recruit agents and have agents who are as good as the top Mossad people, and then they have people who are bumbling at the bottom of, the spectrum of what you could recruit, and that's all they were able to get to. So I'd say there's a wide variety.
Yeah, and I would surmise that if they had really good ones already in the United States, they might have used them for the journalist, for Trump, for any other actions. But then again, you can't not be vigilant. I'll give you that, or I'll give whoever would argue with me that. I want to ask about the ongoing military engagement with Hamas in Gaza. How much of that do you think is driven by the consideration that if Netanyahu engages in this massive war with Iran, certainly a lot of rockets coming in from the north and Hezbollah would be a gigantic vulnerability, and that was taken off the table. But then you have the rockets from Hamas. So how much of turning down offers of ceasefires and peace deals might have been driven with this Iran operation in mind?
So typically, I think the debate in Israel about why Netanyahu is still at war with Hamas in Gaza, why hasn't he cut a permanent ceasefire, which could have returned all or almost all of the hostages and maybe led to normalization with the Saudis, but allowed Hamas basically to stay in Gaza in a weakened capacity, but letting them stay in an organized capacity. The people who tend to be critics of Netanyahu say it's all about the politics. It's all because he has a public corruption trial against him. He has some hard right coalition partners that have made it clear that if he ends the war, they'll topple him. I think that's one side. And then the other side is, the people who are pro-Netanyahu will say, he wants to get rid of Hamas. He does not think Israel can live with Hamas on the border after October 7th. If Hamas is allowed to continue in Gaza, then even if it takes them 5 years, 10 years, eventually they'll make a comeback and they'll be able to try to do another October 7th, which if you followed the news after October 7th, they said, we will do it again and again and again if nobody stops us. They said it publicly and proudly. So I think those are the main things. You could argue that on top of that as long as the Gaza war was continuing, it would be a basis also to hit Iran. But I would say those two are probably more the bigger arguments for his motivations.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, the operations against Hezbollah were necessary to allow Israel to achieve what they achieved against Iran. From when you wrote the hardcover until now, what has been the most shocking to you in terms of the Iranians' lack of capacity? Is it Hezbollah? Is it something else internally? What is it?
I would say Hezbollah. I would say that I was told by every single Israeli defense official for years that Israel could not have a major war with Hezbollah because Hezbollah, with 150,000 rockets, could shoot 6,000 to 8,000 rockets per day. And it wouldn't matter that Israel has Iron Dome and the Arrow and the multi-layered defense system, they would overwhelm it. And even if only 10% got through, 10% of 6,000 is 600 rockets. That could kill thousands, tens of thousands of people in a matter of days and a week. You saw some video footage maybe of Tel Aviv getting hit by the Iranians, I think in 4 or 5 spots. But most of Tel Aviv is basically Tel Aviv. The fear with Hezbollah was they could really burn Tel Aviv to the ground basically with their rockets. And so to see that Israel was able to use this beeper operation to completely catch them off guard and then in a matter of days basically destroy almost all of their heavy missile capacity, all their commanders, Hassan Nasrallah, who'd ruled them for over 30 years, to do all of that in a matter of days. There's no way that I could have seen that coming. I don't think anyone in the Israeli defense establishment believed that they were going to be that successful that fast.
So I want to put to you another argument that I think I understand what the argument is. And it's voiced by a lot of people who I think are generally against or critical of the U.S. involvement in the strikes. And this one is by, it was as quoted in the New Yorker, Kareem Sajapur, scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And he asks, will we look back and say this prevented an Iranian bomb or ensured one? Now, I was trying to understand what the ensured one part is. And this argument goes something like the Iranians are now going to be extra motivated and they'll know they have to do it clandestinely. So they'll sneak and race to a breakout. What's your assessment of that?
I have a major problem with this argument. I understand people make it on a good faith basis, but the idea is, well, right now or until this 12-day war, Iran was definitely at most several months away from a nuclear weapon. They needed to make the choice to do it, but they had the 60% uranium. They had the advanced centrifuges. They had places to hide it. That was not like a maybe. That was like a, yes, it exists. It is a absolute threat. Imminent threat next week, next month, no. But very, very close to that, and maybe a threat we can't catch. Now to say that it is worse, that maybe Iran, now that I'm arguing they're 2 years back, will try harder to get a nuclear weapon and have less compunctions about sort of going all the way, and that's worse than where we were 12 days ago when they were actually really close to it, it doesn't make any sense to me. The other thing is, again, I come back to how did Israel pull all of this off? It was with extensive investment in penetrating Iran. Iran is a country of 90 million people. The Sunnis, the Kurds, the Baluchis all hate the regime. Not like in the United States where you have red states and blue states, but I would think that most people still think they're part of the same country. These people really don't see the Shiites and the Ayatollahs as part of their country. They basically see themselves as occupied. So you literally have tens of millions of people who you can recruit if they're working against the regime, they don't even think they're betraying anyone. They think they're sort of fighting for their own people. And so when you have that level of penetration, no, I don't think that the fact that Iran might try harder in the future is worse than the fact that they were close to a bomb now.
Couple other quick questions. Aren't physicists replaceable? What's the point of killing them?
So physicists are replaceable. We have a whole chapter in our book about killing Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the father of the Iranian bomb, sort of the Oppenheimer of Iran, and they replaced him. And he was a big loss, but they replaced him and they moved forward. The fact that he was killed probably delayed them for 6 months or a year and a half or something, but they replaced him. So yes, the dozen or so nuclear scientists who were killed are replaceable. And that's why, again, I come back to the sheer immensity of all of the things at once. The nuclear scientists, the small nuclear sites, the big nuclear sites, the centrifuges, the uranium, all of these things being hit at once. That is what I think will make it harder for Iran to think about, do they really want to go forward? If they do they really think they're going to be able to sneak it past the Mossad and the Israeli Air Force? But no, if you just look narrowly at the question of can you replace nuclear scientists, for sure you can.
Are the Iranians too committed to the idea and the public messaging of we're going to be a nuclear regime to back off it?
Nobody knows the answer to that question, including the Iranians themselves. They don't know how badly they've been hit. Remember, they basically stopped using their cell phones after the first few days because they were being tracked. And so they probably will only have a full situational assessment of what's happened to them in a month or 2 months. It's going to take them time to go through the rubble of all of these different, places that were hit. It's going to take them time to find people who know how to look and read through, the materials that, were destroyed or partially destroyed. So I don't think we know the answer to that. Obviously, my hope is that they will have taken such a big hit from this that they will say, you know what? We thought a nuclear weapon after the United States invaded Iraq in 2003 was going to be the thing that would save us from regime change. It didn't help us at all. It brought this terrible attack on us. Let's figure out another way. I hope that will be their answer, but I can't say.
So I was listening to Nadav Ayal on Dan Sinor's Call Me Back podcast, and he said, and I don't know if you have any knowledge of this, I don't know if it's true, but it at least put a thought in my head, that the Israelis did some planning about acceptable losses from the Iranians, and they had a range of how many people, how many citizens might die, and it's been in the dozens, but they thought it would be in the low hundreds to, I think the upper limit he articulated was 4,000. And I don't know if that's true or not. Maybe you do. But this brought to mind the fact that the United States tolerance for loss couldn't be more different from the Israelis. The United States probably has a zero tolerance for loss. And I'm not going to say if the hair on the head of one serviceman, because many after the assassination of Soleimani had brain injuries, but I would say if any serviceman dies, if 2 servicemen die, if somehow any American citizen dies, I think it's all going to be seen as not having been worth it to the Americans. A lot there, but my question is, do the Israelis take this into account? How much do they?
They absolutely do, and I'll just come back to 2 dates. 9/11 in the United States and October 7th, 2023 in Israel. After 9/11 in the United States, for the first time, I would say since the Vietnam War, Americans were ready for servicemen to die because thousands of Americans had died on American soil. And that shifted the mentality. And after 9/11 became something that happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, Americans got back into the mentality of, we don't want any of our servicemen to die fighting to protect the country. Israel, until October 7th, was actually, relatively speaking, in the same mentality to where Americans are right now. All right, Israel didn't want to risk. This is, we were talking about before. They didn't want to risk a war with Hezbollah. They didn't want to risk a war with Syria. They didn't want to risk a war with Iran. They didn't want to risk a war with Hamas. So because Israelis have been sort of getting it more in the mentality of it can maintain security using technology and superior firepower without having to risk lives. And October 7th tore that to pieces when 1,200 people, mostly civilians, on your own territory get killed. And you say, okay, we don't have a choice. We need to take the fight to the other side, and that's going to mean a certain number of losses.
Yonah Jeremy Bob is the co-author of Target Tehran, How Mossad is Using Sabotage, Cyberwarfare, Assassination, and Secret Diplomacy to Stop a Nuclear Iran and Realignment of the New Middle East. I have to give a recommendation. It's well reported. It's really well written and exciting. There's a lot of diplomatic considerations, how the Abraham Accords hinged on settlements in the West Bank. It's really a fascinating read, and Yonah's been doing excellent reporting for the Jerusalem Post. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.